Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. Thomas Bragg rose at 5 o'clock, as he had risen every morning of his working life, with the exception of the Sunday mornings, when he had been ill enough to remain in bed, which in 58 years had been perhaps a dozen times, and the morning of his wife's funeral, when he had risen at 4, because sleep had abandoned him entirely. He dressed in the kitchen by the light of the range, which he had banked the night before, and which required only the addition of 2 turves of peat and a turning of the damper to bring back to a working heat. He pulled on his boots, the left one first, which was the order in which he had always put his boots on, and to which he gave no particular thought, being the kind of man who performed his habits without examining them, on the grounds that a habit that had served for 40 years required no examination. He drank his tea standing, looking out of the small kitchen window at the Borrowdale morning, the valley below still dark, the fell above beginning to show its outline against the paling sky, the particular grey and green of the Herdwick country taking shape as the light increased. He had been looking at this view every morning for 31 years, since he had come to Seathwaite Farm at the age of 27. First as his uncle's tenant's assistant, then taking over the tenancy himself in 1872, when his uncle grew too old for the work. Before that, he had looked at a very similar view from his father's farm 4 miles up the dale. The fell looked the same from both angles. It had looked the same for longer than Thomas or his father, or any person in the chain of persons who had farmed this country could account for. He took his crook from its place beside the kitchen door, a long ash staff with a horn head, the grip polished to a deep amber by the accumulated contact of his hand, and he opened the door and he went out. Bess was at his feet before the door was half open, her pale eyes already on the fell, her body already oriented toward the work. The morning was cool and still, the kind of September morning that the Lake District produced in the weeks between summer and the autumn rains. A clarity in the air that was neither warm nor cold, but was something between them. A quality of light that the fell received and returned without alteration. Thomas walked across the fold yard, through the gate in the lower wall, and began to climb. He counted in the old way, not because he could not count in the ordinary English way. He could and did, for the purposes that required it, the ledger, the guide, the transactions at the sale. But on the fell, counting the sheep as they passed through the gap in the wall or stood on the knowe where he could see them against the sky, he counted in the way his father had counted, and his father's father before that: tyan, tethera, methera, pimp, cethera, lethera, hovera, dovera, dick, 1 through 10 in the ancient Cumbrian counting system that was older than the English language, a counting system that had survived because shepherds on these fells had been counting in it since there were shepherds on these fells. He reached Yandan tethera before the modern farmer's mind would have registered a number. He reached Dig, 10, and began again. Yan adig, tan adig, and so on toward Bumfit, 15, and then Gigad, 20, counting in groups as the method required, making a notch in the crook's grip with his thumbnail for each completed score, the physical memory of the count preserved in the wood. This morning, 312 sheep, where 312 sheep should be. He made this assessment, not with the urgency of a man who feared they might not all be there, but with the satisfaction of a man confirming what he expected to find, which was that the flock was where it should be, because the flock was always where it should be, because the flock was Herdwick sheep on their own heath, and the heath was the one thing a Herdwick ewe knew as well as she knew her own lambs. He stood on the knowe in the September morning and looked at his 312 sheep, and knew, without being able to explain it in a way that would satisfy a philosopher, that they were all present and accounted for, and that the fell was as it should be. The shepherd's guide lived on the second shelf of the kitchen dresser, at Seathwaite, between the farm ledger and the almanac, in a position it had occupied for as long as Thomas could remember, and which he had never seen reason to change. It was a printed pamphlet, not large, octavo, perhaps 60 pages, the cover grey and slightly worn at the corners, and it contained, in small columns of type, arranged alphabetically by farm name, the lug mark of every Herdwick flock in the district, the pattern of notches clipped from each farm's sheep's ears that identified them as belonging to that farm, and which allowed any shepherd who found a stray to look it up in the guide and return it to its owner. The guide had been published since 1817, which was before Thomas's grandfather had come to the valley, and the entry for Seathwaite Farm had been in it since that first edition, a left ear with a slit at the tip and a hole below, and a right ear with a slit at the base. This mark had been on Seathwaite's sheep for 66 years, and on whatever sheep had been Seathwaite's before that. No one was certain how far back the mark went, but it was old. It was the kind of old that became invisible through continuity, the way a stone wall becomes invisible when it has been in the same place for 300 years. Thomas opened the guide on the morning of the 2nd of September to check the entry he had made in pencil at the meet last October. A stray from High Rig Farm, a yow with good teeth, returned to her owner John Fleming, who had been looking for her since August. The penciled note was in his own handwriting, smaller and more careful than his everyday hand, the handwriting he used for the guide, because the guide was a document, and documents required care. He turned to Seathwaite's entry. The printed type had been there since 1817. His father had added a penciled note in 1852 about the year the flock had been reduced by the hard winter. Thomas had added his own notes in the years since 1872, when the farm had become his. The guide was a living document, the printed facts overlaid with the penciled experience, the official record amended by the actual record, the knowledge accumulating in the margins. He found the stray on the 3rd Thursday of September, on the upper fell above the intake wall, in the bowl of ground on the eastern side of the ridge where Seathwaite's heath ended and the neighbouring farm of Thornythwaite began. She was a yow, a mature ewe, with a distinctive dark patch on her left shoulder that he had not seen before, which meant she was not one of his. She was grazing calmly, unhurried, in the manner of Herdwick ewes, who have decided they are in the right place and see no reason to be disturbed. He checked her ears, left ear, a slit at the tip and a small notch below. Almost Seathwaite's mark, but not quite. Right ear, 2 notches at the base. He took out the guide from his coat pocket. He always carried it on the fell during the September and October weeks, when the autumn gather approached and strays were most likely, and turned to the relevant pages. The mark was Stonethwaite Farm, a holding 2 miles up the valley, tenanted now by the Atkinson family. He had found a Stonethwaite ewe on this same stretch of fell 2 years ago and returned her at the October meet. He made a note in the guide's margin, September 19th. Stonethwaite Yow, approximately 4 years, Upper Fell East Ridge, for return at Wasdale meet or earlier. He moved the ewe downhill with Bess's help, gently, not rushing her, allowing her to understand through the dog's steady pressure and his own positioning where she was being asked to go. She went with the docile pragmatism of a sheep that knows it is being herded rather than pursued, and has decided cooperation is the sensible response. He brought her to the lower field and separated her with a small group of his own ewes, where she would be comfortable until the meet. He noted in the farm ledger that evening, 1 stray Stonethwaite held for return. He thought nothing more of it. This was part of the work, one of the 100 small transactions of the shepherd's year that neither distressed him nor particularly interested him, being simply the right thing to do in the same way that mending a wall or clearing a beck was simply the right thing to do, because the farm required it, and because other people's farms required what his farm could provide. And the district worked on this principle of mutual attention. The Eskdale show was held on the last Saturday of September at the Woolpack Inn, which was where the Felldales Association for the Improvement of Herdwick Sheep had held its show since 1864, and which was the most important single day in the Herdwick shepherd's year, the day when the tups, the rams who would go out with the ewes in November, were judged and sold and hired, and when the quality of each farm's flock was assessed against the standards of the association and the standards of the district. Thomas drove the 3 tups he was showing down the fell track before dawn, with Bess keeping them on the road with the patient efficiency of a dog who has made this journey before and knows its demands. The track from Borrowdale to Eskdale went over Hard Knot Pass, a road that required attention in the dark, the gradient steep and the stones loose at the edges. And he reached the show ground at 7 in the morning, which was an hour before the judging began, which was the time a man needed to arrive if he wanted to look at his animals in good light and settle them before the ring. His tups were Seathwaite stock, large in the bone, well-wooled, with the white faces and the grey bodies that the association valued, and with the broad, level backs that indicated the kind of body condition that came from spending a life on the fell rather than being pushed in the in-by on supplementary feed. He did not push his sheep. He had never pushed his sheep. He held the view, which was his father's view and his grandfather's view, that a Herdwick tup prepared for a show by being overfed in a field was not a fell tup and would not produce fell sheep. He placed second in his class, which he had expected. The Atkinson tup from Stonethwaite was a better animal than his best, and Thomas acknowledged this without resentment, as a shepherd acknowledges the weather. It was what it was, and the guide would show over the years what the results of the breeding decisions had been, and the fell would show what the sheep could do, and these were the only judgments that lasted. The tups went out with the ewes on the 5th of November, which was the traditional date in Borrowdale, a tradition maintained not for its own sake, but because November 5th was the date that produced April lambs, and April lambs in the Lake District were early enough to catch the first grass of spring, but late enough to be born after the worst of the March snows. The calculation had been made by the shepherds of the district over centuries of lambing, the date refined by experience into the date that was right. Thomas went out before dawn on the 5th with the raddle, the red dye that was smeared on the tups' chests before they were put out, so that when a ewe had been mated, her fleece carried the mark, and Thomas could record which ewes had been served and when. He made the raddle as his father had made it, iron ore from the beck mixed with grease, the oldest recipe in the shepherd's year, unchanged since the practice had begun in this valley. He led the 3 tups into the ewe flock at first light. The ewes that were ready knew it immediately, moving toward the tups with the purposeful ease of animals that know what this day is and have been waiting for it. The tups moved through the flock with authority. Bess watched from a distance, not working. There was nothing for her to do today, just watching, as she watched everything, with the alert attention of a dog who is always ready for the thing she cannot yet see. Thomas watched too. He counted the ewes that carried the raddle mark at the end of the first day, 14. At the end of the first week, 62. The numbers were consistent with previous years, which told him the flock was in good condition, the ewes cycling as they should, the tups working well. He wrote the daily counts in the farm ledger. He wrote in the guide's margin, tups out, November 5th, 1883. Good take. Expected lambing from April 5th. He had a habit, not one he would have named as a habit, being the kind of man who did not name his habits, of sitting on the fell at the end of the working day, in the weeks when the weather allowed it, which in the Lake District was a narrower window than it would have been in the south, but which in September and the better days of October was possible. The evening light on the fell, the day's work done, the flock checked for the last time, nothing required of him for the hour before dark. He sat on the large flat stone at the top of the first wall, the stone that had been there since before the wall was built, a glacial erratic that the wall builder had incorporated rather than moved, which was a sensible decision that Thomas had always respected when he paused to think about it, which was not often. He put his crook across his knees. Bess settled at his feet. The flock was spread across the fell above and below, grey shapes in the September evening, cropping the last of the summer grass before the season's end. The Borrowdale valley was below him, the white farmhouses and the green of the valley floor in the last evening light, the beck catching the sun's last angle and running silver between its alders. Above him, the fell continued to the ridge and then to the high tops, where the sky was still bright with the evening's colour. To the east, the Helvellyn Range, darkening. To the west, Glaramara, familiar as his own hand. He did not think about anything in particular. This was not an emptiness of mind, but the quality of attention that a man develops when he has spent 30 years looking at the same landscape and knows it well enough to read it without effort. The color of the cloud that means rain by morning, the way the beck sounds when the fell has been dry, the particular movement of the sheep that indicates they are settled for the night. He read all of this without forming it into words. The fell told him what it told him, and he received it. Bess's ear moved toward the ridge. He followed her attention. Two of the hogs, the young sheep in their first year, not yet trusted on the high fell on their own, had drifted toward the ridge boundary. He stood. He whistled. Bess was already moving before the whistle was finished. The hogs turned. They came down. Beyond the lug marks, the ear notches that identified each farm in the guide, there were the smit marks, the colored markings applied to the sheep's fleece in patterns that differed from farm to farm, adding a second layer of identification to the first. Seathwaite's smit was a red mark on the left shoulder, applied with a wooden stamp dipped in raddle, renewed at the autumn gathering when the flock came down from the high fell for the last time before winter. Thomas renewed the smit marks on the last Saturday of October, which was the day of the autumn gather, the day when every shepherd in the valley brought his flock down from the common fell to the inn by land, working together with the communal efficiency that fell farming required, and that Wordsworth had called. In a passage Thomas had been shown by the schoolmaster at Rostwaite, and had not forgotten, a perfect republic of shepherds. The shepherds of the valley came at first light, each with his dog, each knowing his section of the fell, and by midday the entire common had been swept, and the sheep sorted into their farm groups, and the strays held for the meat. Thomas worked the smit stamp with the careful thoroughness that the task required. Each ewe through the sorting gate, each one held while he applied the mark, each one released into the home field. 312 ewes. The mark on each one, a red left shoulder. The mark that said, "This sheep is Seathwaite's," has always been Seathwaite's, will be Seathwaite's when the next tenant comes. The next tenant was something he did not think about often. He had no son. His daughter had married a farmer at Keswick who had no sheep. The farm was tenanted land, his for his lifetime, and when his time was done, the tenancy would pass to another, and the flock would go with it. The 312 ewes, with their heft knowledge, their lug marks, their smit marks, passing from one set of hands to the next, as they had always passed. The farm changed tenants. The sheep knew the fell. The shepherd's meet at Wasdale Head was held on the second Saturday of November, in the narrow valley that lay across the pass from Borrowdale, and Thomas had attended it every year since he was 12, which was 46 years. He went because it was the valley's duty to attend it, because the strays had to be returned, and the neighbours met, and the guide's corrections confirmed, and because the evening at the Wasdale Head Inn was the kind of evening that the Herdwick shepherds of 4 valleys, Wasdale, Eskdale, Borrowdale, Ennerdale, made the centre of their year. He took the Stonethwaite ewe with him, the stray he had held since September, tied loosely with a cord around her neck, walking beside him on the track over Stye Head. The pass was hard going in November, the becks running high, the stones wet, the cloud already on the high tops, even in the morning. He reached Wasdale Head at noon, the ewe with him, Bess behind him, the pass behind all of them. The meet was held in the field beside the inn. 28 shepherds, perhaps 70 strays between them, brought from the 4 valleys. The guide was consulted, page after page. Each ewes earmarks, checked and confirmed. Each farm's sheep sorted into the right group. Atkinson of Stonethwaite was there. Thomas delivered his ewe. Atkinson, who was a man of few words, even by fell farmer standards, thanked him with a nod and a hand on the shoulder and a pint bought at the bar that evening. This was the complete transaction. The ewe returned. The district continued. In the guide that evening, Thomas made the note. Stonethwaite ewe returned. 1 recorded. He looked at the list of his own marks for the year. 3 strays returned to him. 1 from the Atkinson flock itself, they had exchanged, unknowing, in August. 1 from Gill Farm further down the valley. 1 from Borrowdale. 3 strays found. 3 returned. This was the year's balance. On the last day of November, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the shepherd's guide and wrote the month's annotations, a practice he had developed over the years of caring for the guide, which distinguished Saithwaite's copy from the copies held at other farms by the thoroughness of the marginal records. Not just the strays returned, but the condition of the flock at month's end, the weather of the month, the state of the walls, the notes of particular importance for future reference. He wrote, November 1883, tups out November 5th, 84 ewes marked by end of week 1, 186 by end of week 2. Good take. Wasdale meet, November 11th. Stonethwaite ewe returned. 3 strays received in turn from Atkinson, Gill, Borrowdale. Flock numbers at month end, 312 ewes. 3 tups, 98 gimmer hogs, wintered in by. Weather, dry until 19th, then 3 days of rain. Fell becks high on 20th, settled by 22nd. No losses. Below this, he wrote, in the smaller hand, he used for the guide's more permanent notes. The Atkinson tup that won at Eskdale is a fine animal. I have asked for the hire of him for 2 weeks in November 84. Atkinson agreed. This will bring new blood to Seathwaite without buying. Father would approve. The Atkinson line has always been good. He paused. Then he wrote, below this, 58 years, 31 at Seathwaite. The flock is good. The fell is the same fell. He closed the guide. He put it back on the dresser shelf. He banged the fire. He went to bed with the November wind on the roof and the flock in the home field below and the fell above all of it, dark and holding the sky, indifferent to the wind and the date and to Thomas Bragg's 58 years, as it had been indifferent to every shepherd who had kept sheep on it for the 1,000 years before him. December in Borrowdale began dry and hard, the ground frozen by the 2nd week to a depth that made the morning walk across the fold yard a different experience from the November walk. The flagstones ringing under the boots, the iron pump handle in the yard cold enough to burn the hand that grasped it without a glove. Thomas had put the pump rags round the handle on the 1st of the month, as he did every December, with the wrapping technique his father had taught him. 2 layers of sacking, tied with binder twine, adjusted for the hand. A small thing. It had saved him and his father and his grandfather from frozen handle burns for 80 years at this one pump. The flock was down from the high fell now, as they were every December. The older ewes and the in-lamb ewes in the home field and the fold yard, the young tups and the gimmer hogs on the lower common, where they could be reached without the full fell climb. The work of December was different from the work of September. September had been about the high fell and the autumn gather. December was about the daily check, the water trough not frozen over, or, if frozen, broken open, the hay given to the in-lamb ewes in the evening, the count of the flock taken each morning. 312 ewes, 3 tups, 98 gimmer hogs. 41 hogs wintered away at a farm in the Eden Valley on the long-standing arrangement that Thomas had maintained with the Stubbs family at Moorland since 1875. The Shah young sheep sent down to the milder lowland for the winter, to return in the spring for their first summer on the fell. The arrangement cost him 9 shillings a head for the season, and was worth every penny. The fell was hard enough on the ewes in December without adding the burden of untried hogs who had not yet learned the winter wisdom the ewes had. He walked the daily rounds in the December cold, Bess at his heel, the crook worn smooth by the glove he now wore against the iron cold in the morning. The landscape was black and white, black walls, white grass, grey sheep against it, the sky a hard pale grey that promised snow by Christmas. The first snow came on the morning of the 19th of December, which was 2 days before the shortest day, which was itself in the middle of the season that Thomas had been reading the signs of since the 12th. He had known it was coming, the particular quality of the wind that had come down the valley from the north on the 17th, carrying the cold of the high country above the cloud, the way the sheep had moved by themselves toward the lower field on the 18th. The colour of the cloud over Scafell on the evening of the 18th, which was the cloud that meant snow by morning. He rose at 5 as always. He looked out of the kitchen window. Snow. Not a heavy fall. 3 or 4 inches on the ground. The fell above white, but not yet deep. But the beginning of the season the fell had promised. He drank his tea. He put on the heavy coat. He opened the door. The world had changed colour. The black walls were now dark grey lines against the white ground. The grey sheep in the home field were visible against the white grass by their darker shading and the movement of them as they shifted against the cold. The sky was the particular pale that snow sky was, not the blue of clear winter, but the luminous grey-white that held more snow somewhere above it. He walked the rounds. He counted the flock, 312 in the home field, all present. The hogs on the lower common would need checking later. They had sheltered instincts, but they were young, and this was their first real snow. He broke the ice on the troughs with the wooden mallet that lived beside each trough for this purpose. He gave the in-lamb ewes their hay. He did not hurry. Hurrying in winter on the fell was how men injured themselves. He wrote in the guide that evening, December 19th, first snow, 3 inches, flock at home field all present. Hogs on lower common checked, 42 present, all well. Weather set fair for 2 or 3 days of cold. Watching the pass, he discovered it on the morning of the 2nd of January, which was a Tuesday, when he made the count of the lower common flock and found, instead of the 42 hogs he had been recording through December, 38, 4 missing. He counted again. 38. He counted a third time, which was the practice his father had taught him for any surprising number. Count once for the count twice for the record, count 3 times for the fact, 3 counts. 38. The fell had received 2 heavier falls of snow between Christmas and New Year. 8 inches on the 27th, another 4 on the 31st, and the hogs on the lower common had come through the first fall well, but the second had come with a north wind that had driven the snow into drifts along the walls and ridges. If any of the hogs had sheltered in the wrong place, and the snow had built up over them, they could be under drifts now, trapped but possibly still alive. He whistled Bess forward. He took the crook and the shovel from the shed. He went out to the lower common in the January cold with the particular alertness of a shepherd who has lost sheep and means to find them, if finding is possible, and to account for them, if finding is not. The lower common was 300 acres. The possible drift sites were, to a shepherd who knew the ground, perhaps a dozen specific locations: the leeward sides of particular walls, the hollows behind certain large rocks, the corners where the north wind would pile snow against the boundary. He worked through them methodically, starting with the most likely, the wall that ran up the eastern boundary, where the drift would build against the stones on the leeward side. He found the first hog at the third drift site, beneath 18 inches of drifted snow, alive. The shepherd's tool for this situation was the crook. You felt through the snow with the hook until you found something solid. Then you used the shovel to clear away. The hog was curled into the smallest possible shape, conserving heat, her breath creating a small cavity of warm air around her muzzle. Herdwicks were engineered for this. She would have been fine for another day at least, but finding her now was better. He carried her down to the lower field. He returned to the drift. He found the second hog, 10 yards further along the same wall, also alive. He worked until dusk. He found 3 hogs alive. The fourth he did not find that day. He returned the next morning with Bess and the shovel and a second lantern, because the days were short in January and the light went by 4. And he worked the drifts along the other walls, the hollows behind the larger rocks, the corners where he had not yet checked. He found her at the 11th drift site, in a hollow behind the holly tree at the upper edge of the common, under perhaps 24 inches of snow. She was dead. She had been dead for 2 or 3 days. The body was cold and stiff beneath the snow, the eyes closed, the posture the curled small posture of a sheep that had gone to sleep in what it had thought was shelter and had not woken. He did not grieve. This was not because he did not feel the loss. He did, in the particular way a shepherd felt the loss of an animal he had known from birth, which was not the same way a man felt the loss of another man, but was not nothing, but because the work required attention, and the attention required not grieving. He carried her down in the sack he had brought. He would bury her in the plot at the lower corner of the home field where Seathwaite had always buried its winter losses. He wrote that evening, January 3rd, hog lost, drifted against the holly tree, upper lower common, recovered dead. 3 hogs recovered alive from drifts along the eastern wall. Flock total now 311 ewes. 1 old ewe passed in sleep on December 28th, recorded. 3 tubs, 97 gimmer hogs. The drift winter so far has cost 1 hog, acceptable by the standards of any Lake District winter. Below this he wrote, smaller. She would have been Annabel's line. Out of the black-faced ewe we called Annabel, because she was the first to lamb in 1880. A 3-year line lost. Will re-strengthen through the Atkinson Tup next year. The second week of January had him indoors more than out in the evenings. The short days meant the dark came by 4, and after the flock was bedded for the night and the yard was closed, there was little to do outside that could not wait for morning, and the kitchen fire and the guide were waiting. He spent these evenings with the guide in a way he did not spend any other evenings of the year, reading it, not just annotating, reading the entries for the other farms of the district and the meets of the years before his own, the accumulated record of the Herdwick country in this one small pamphlet that lived on his dresser shelf. The guide was older than any book in the house. His father had given him this copy in 1872 when the tenancy passed to Thomas, and his father had received it from his own father in 1846, and before that the copy had belonged to his great-uncle Samuel, who had first farmed Seathwaite in 1829. Over 50 years of Bragg hands had turned these pages. Annotations in the margins in hands he did not know from the early decades. Entries from 1831 onwards, when his great-uncle began keeping his own record 2 years after taking the tenancy, and Thomas had not yet been born. He read, on a January evening in 1884, an annotation in his great-uncle Samuel's hand, dated 1831. Long winter this year. Lost 9 hogs in the drifts of February. Flock rebuilt by the good lambing of 32. The fell recovers faster than the farm. He read in his father's hand, dated 1852. Hardest winter I have known. 23 ewes lost between January and March. Tenant Crosthwaite at Thornithwaite lost half his flock. Seathwaite spared the worst because of the lower commons shelter. We will be years recovering. He read his own annotation, dated January 1883. A mild winter, no losses to weather. 2 ewes lost to old age in February. A good year to be an old farm. He thought, the guide is the memory of the fell. Each generation writes its season into it. The pencil fades, but the record holds. He wrote for January 1884. 1 hog lost to drift at the Holly Tree, January 3rd. The rest of the flock well. The winter is neither the mildest nor the hardest. The fell requires this year what every year requires, attention and the willingness to walk in any weather. The storm came on the 14th of February, which was a Thursday, and it came with the particular authority of the Lake District's worst weather, a north-easterly wind that began on the evening of the 13th and strengthened through the night, carrying snow that was first wet and then cold, the temperature dropping steadily so that by the early hours of the 14th, the snow had become dry and fine and driven, the kind of snow that built drifts against every wall and in every hollow, that obscured the fell within an hour of beginning, that killed men who tried to cross the passes in it, and sheep who could not find their hef. Thomas knew by the wind at 10 on the 13th that the 14th would be a day to stay close to home. He banked the fire high. He put extra hay in the fold yard. He checked the lantern's oil, the door's latch, the wall of the lower shelter, where some of the younger ewes sometimes went if the wind came from the wrong direction. He did not go to bed until midnight, which was 2 hours later than his usual hour, because he wanted to hear the winds turning and know which direction it would set into before he slept. It set into the northeast. He slept 2 hours. He was up at 3. The storm was at its height. The farmhouse shook with the gusts. He could not see the far wall of the fold yard from the kitchen window. He lit the lantern. He opened the door to the porch and stood there for a moment listening, because in this kind of storm the ear heard things the eye could not see. The direction of the wind's force, the sound of the beck below the house. Higher than usual, he judged. The storm was bringing rain below the snow line. The occasional sound of the flock in the home field, bunched together for warmth and calling in the particular voice they use for weather. He did not go out. The flock was in the lowest and most sheltered part of the farm. They would survive the storm without his intervention, and attempting intervention in a storm of this severity would accomplish nothing except endangering himself and Bess. The shepherd's work in a storm of this severity was to wait. The storm blew through on the afternoon of the 14th, exhausting itself against the fells with the particular tiredness that extreme weather always showed. The wind dropping by 4, the snow thinning to flakes by 5, the sky beginning to show the pale grey blue of a cleared sky by 7. Thomas waited until the wind was fully gone before he went out, which was 8 in the evening, by which time the dark was complete, and the damage, if any, would not be accessible until morning. He found the flock at the lowest corner of the home field, where they had gathered in a dense pack against the angle of 2 walls. They had come through the storm by the method Herdwicks had evolved over 1,000 years. The thickest fleeced and strongest ewes on the outside of the pack with their backs to the wind, the younger and weaker ewes in the center, the whole flock shifting slowly so that each ewe took her turn on the windward side. The strategy of the pack, refined across centuries, executed without a shepherd's instruction. He counted the pack as best he could by lantern light. 310. 2 ewes, not present. He could not tell in the dark whether they had been lost in the storm or had simply drifted to another corner of the field. He would have to wait for morning. He did not sleep much that night. He lay in the dark listening to the house settle in the cold, and to Bess's breathing on the flagstones beside the bed, and to the beck running high below the farm. And he counted the flock in his mind, the 2 missing, their particular markings, where they might be. And he did not think in words, but in images of the fell and the field and the possible shelters. He was at the home field at first light on the 15th. The flock was still bunched in the corner. He moved them slowly, spreading them out so he could count them properly in the morning light. Bess worked the outside of the pack, pressing it gently to open it up without panicking the tired sheep. 310. He counted 3 times. 310. He walked the field for the 2 missing. He found them near the upper gate, one a yearling, the other a 4-year-old ewe who had always been slightly slower-witted than the others. They had drifted against the upper wall during the night's confusion and had been separated from the pack by a wind-driven drift that had accumulated along the wall. They were alive. The 4-year-old was lame. A knock against the wall in the storm, probably. and the yearling was shivering badly. He brought them both down to the fold yard and put them in the covered end where the ranger's chimney warmth reached through the wall. 312. He counted the whole flock in the daylight, to be certain. 312. He sat down on the mounting block outside the kitchen door and looked at his flock in the cold grey morning after the storm, and he thought about nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. Bess sat at his feet. The sun came up over the ridge of Glaramara, pale and without warmth but present, and the fell above the farm came into view gradually as the light increased, white with the storm's deposit, the walls visible as dark lines, the upper tops holding their new snow against the pale blue sky. He thought, finally, the flock is here. 312. The worst weather of the winter did not take one of them. The fell gave them the shelter, and the sheep used the shelter, and I did nothing, and they survived. This is how it has always been. By the last week of February, the flock was showing the first of the spring's signs, not in the weather, which remained cold and alternately snowy and wet through February, in the way that Lake District winters usually did, but in the sheep themselves, the ewes' bodies beginning to show the weight of the in-lamb condition, their movement slower, their appetite at the hay increased. Thomas watched them at the morning feeding with the practiced eye of 30 years of lambing, estimating which ewes would lamb first, which would need watching, which were in their strongest condition, and which were carrying the pregnancy with difficulty. He estimated 70 of the ewes would lamb in the first week of April, the early cohort, from the first week of tupping in November. The main body of the lambing would come between April 8th and April 22nd. A few late ewes, perhaps 15, would lamb in the last week of April. These estimates were based on the raddle records of November and the condition of the ewes now, and would be refined further over the March weeks as the ewes' bodies told him more. He wrote in the guide, February 26th, flock in good condition going into lambing, first expected from April 5th. Main body, April 8th to 22nd. Will bring ewes to Loisfield March 15th for closer observation. Ordering lambing chains and iodine from Rostwaite's store this week. He stood in the kitchen doorway that evening, looking up the valley to the fell. The snow was still on the high tops, but the lower fell was greening at the edges, the first of the winter's grass showing through the melt in the sheltered corners. In 3 weeks, the ewes would come down to the lowest field. In 6 weeks, the first lamb would be born. The cycle had turned. It would go on turning. On the last day of February, Thomas sat with the guide in the late evening and wrote the winter's summary, a practice he had inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather, whose earliest summary entries in the guide dated from 1842. The seasonal summary was the winter's reflection, the period after the storms when the shepherd could look back across the months and assess what the winter had cost and what it had kept. He wrote, Winter, 1883 to 84, mild to November. First snow, December 19th. Storm of February 14th, the worst of the season, but the flock came through, with no losses in the storm itself. Credit to Herdwick pack behaviour and the Loisfield's shelter. 1 hog lost to drift, January 3rd, buried at the lower corner. 1 ewe lost to old age, December 28th. Flock at end of winter, 310 ewes in lamb, 3 tubs, 97 gimmer hogs. 41 wintered hogs to return from moorland in April. Anticipated lambs from April 5th. Below this, weather was hard in February, but not as hard as 1852. We came through with minimal losses. The fell was kind this winter. The storms came in short bouts, with clear days between. The drifts did not stay built up long enough to hide the flock for multiple days. A winter to be grateful for, in the measure that a fell farmer is grateful for. Weather, not pleased, but content. The fell did not take more than it gave. He put the guide back on the dresser shelf. He stood for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the house. The slight settling of the stones in the cold, the rise of the fire in the range as the damper drew, Bess asleep on the flagstones, the wind in the chimney, and thought, the winter is done. The lambing comes. The year turns. The first lamb of 1884 was born on the morning of the 4th of April, which was a Friday, in the lowest field under the hawthorn, where the older ewe, who was always the first to lamb, had always been the first to lamb for the 5 years she had been lambing at Seathwaite. Thomas found her at the 6 o'clock round, the ewe standing over her lamb, licking it dry in the April dawn, the lamb already on its feet though barely, wobbling as Herdwick lambs always wobbled in their first 10 minutes, its fleece still wet and dark, the characteristic black coat of a Herdwick lamb that would lighten to brown and then to grey over the coming year. He stood at the field wall and did not interfere. This was the first principle of Herdwick lambing. Do not interfere unless interference is required. The older ewes knew what they were doing. They had been lambing themselves for centuries before there were shepherds who wrote it down, and the fell was not a place where lambing could be supervised with any degree of completeness anyway. In the lambing weeks, the flock was spread across the in-by and the lower common, and a shepherd who tried to attend every birth would miss every birth. You walked the rounds, you corrected the problems, you left the rest to the ewes. The lambs suckled within 10 minutes of Thomas's arrival, which was the first and most critical step. The colostrum, the thick yellow first milk, carrying the antibodies and the nutrients the lamb needed to survive the first week. The ewe licked the lamb clean. The lamb butted her udder and fed. Thomas watched the whole transaction complete and noted in his mind, Rosamond's lamb, black, apparently healthy, suckling by 6:15, 1st of 1884. He walked on. There would be more, many more, in the next 3 weeks. But there was always a particular quality to the first one. The year had begun. The thing about Herdwick lambs that the visitors to the district always remarked upon, the handful of tourists who came to Borrowdale in April, the occasional relative visiting from the south, was that they were black, not dark grey or brown, but black, the fleece as dark as a raven's wing, the small bodies stark against the grass of the lambing field, as nothing else in Lake District farming was stark. The ewes were grey, the lambs were black. Thomas had been asked many times why they were born black when they would grow up grey. He did not know the answer, and did not pretend to. The answer he gave when pressed was that Herdwicks had been born black for as long as anyone remembered, and that the black coats faded to brown by the first summer and to grey by the first shearing, and that whatever reason the breed had originally arrived at this coloration was buried in the centuries before the guide was written, and was not his business. By the 10th of April, 54 lambs had been born at Seathwaite, all of them black. The lambing field was its characteristic April spectacle. Grey ewes with their black lambs, the lambs in their small dark groups, the ewes calling them when it was time to feed, the lambs answering in their higher voices, the whole field a constant motion of small black bodies moving between larger grey ones. Bess watched the field with the particular attention of a sheepdog in lambing season, which was the attention of a dog who knew she was not required to work and was waiting patiently for the moment when she would be. The moment came on the 11th. Ewe number 43, a first-time lamber, nervous, inexperienced, had delivered her lamb in the exposed corner of the field, had not yet licked it clean, and was showing signs of abandoning it. Thomas whistled Bess to position, walked in slowly, caught the lamb, wiped its face with a cloth from his pocket, and put it against the ewe's side where she could smell it. The ewe hesitated. Then she licked. The bonding completed. The lamb suckled. Bess sat. Thomas walked on. On the 15th of April at 2 in the afternoon, Thomas found a ewe labouring in difficulty. She was one of the 3-year-olds, her second lambing, not her first, and she had been pushing for over an hour by the time he reached her on his round, and the lamb was not coming. He knelt beside her. He examined gently. The lamb was presenting wrong. One leg forward, the other back, the head turned against the pelvis. A correction was required. This was the part of lambing that no shepherd enjoyed and every shepherd had to do. He washed his hands in the bucket he always carried in lambing season, rolled his sleeve above the elbow, and reached in carefully with the technique his father had taught him. Find the second leg, bring it forward, align the head, guide the lamb into the correct presentation. It took 7 or 8 minutes of slow, careful work, during which the ewe bore the intervention with the patient fortitude that Herdwicks generally showed in this situation. Then the lamb was right. The ewe pushed. The lamb came. It was alive. It took a breath. It was black, like all its year's cohort, and it was wet, and it was for the next 10 seconds uncertain whether it would survive. And then it breathed the second time, and its small body stirred, and the ewe turned to it and licked it. And Thomas sat back on his heels and wiped his arm on the cloth and thought, another one. He did not feel triumphant. He had done what he had been trained to do. The ewe had done the hard part. The lamb would live or not live on the basis of the next 12 hours. He made the notes. Ewe 47. Difficult presentation. Corrected successfully. Lamb alive at birth. To be checked every 2 hours tonight. Will Sowerby came in his second week of April, as he had come for the 2 previous years, sent by his mother from the neighbouring farm at Rostwaite to help with the lambing in the way that farmers' children in the valley had always helped with the lambing. He was 13, lean, quick-handed, with the complete absence of sentiment about sheep that came from being raised among them. He did not find the lambing charming. He found it work. Thomas approved of this. Will arrived at 6 on the Monday morning and stayed until dusk for 14 days, which was the lambing period his mother had committed him to, and which he had performed without complaint in each of the previous 2 years. He walked the rounds with Thomas. He held ewes for difficult births. He watched and learned and did not ask unnecessary questions, which was the quality Thomas had noticed about him in the first year and had confirmed in the second. On the afternoon of the third day, Will said, "Your Bess is better than our Pip." "Bess is older," Thomas said. 8 years. Pip is what, 2? 3. Give him 2 more seasons. A good collie doesn't come into her full work until 5. Your father knows this." Will considered this. How long will Bess work? Thomas thought. Another 2 seasons, perhaps 3. She's slowing on the high fell. I'll keep her for the lower work until she tells me she's done. Will nodded. It was not a sentimental nod. It was the nod of a boy who understood that sheepdogs had working lives, and that working lives ended, and that this was not a matter for distress, but for planning. The peak of lambing came in the week of the 15th to the 22nd of April, during which 142 lambs were born at Seathwaite, which was an average of 20 a day, which meant that at the peak of the peak, there were days when 4 lambs were born within an hour. Thomas and Will walked the rounds from first light until dark, then again after supper with lanterns. Bess slept when they slept, which was perhaps 5 hours a night. The work had a rhythm, the checks at dawn, midday, dusk, and midnight, the count of new lambs at each check, the identification of difficulties, the interventions when required, the careful numbering of the lambs in the ledger, each one with its mother's tally number and the date and time of birth, and the particular marks that would distinguish it as it grew. A white sock on the left forefoot, a slightly smaller build than its mother's usual lambs, twins where the previous year had been a single lamb. These were the details that would matter in September when the lambs were weaned and sorted, and that would matter next April when Thomas would look at the records and know which ewes had produced well and which had not. At the peak, on the 18th, he stood in the lambing field at dusk and looked at what the week had brought. 310 ewes, 204 of them now with lambs at foot, some with twins. He counted the lambs alive, 236. 13 dead at birth or shortly after, an expected loss, perhaps slightly higher than last year, but within the normal range. The living lambs were black shapes in the April dusk, small and vigorous, beside their grey mothers. He said to Will, who was standing beside him, "This is why we do it." Will, who was 13 and had been working for 12 hours, did not answer in words. He nodded. He sat on the big flat stone on the 22nd of April, which was the Tuesday after the lambing peak had passed its most intense phase. Will, having gone home to Rostwaite the day before with a shilling from Thomas's pocket and his mother's year's thanks, conveyed through Thomas's usual quiet delivery of such sentiments, and the flock below the stone spread across the lambing field in the April evening with the particular calm that followed a successful lambing peak. Most of the ewes with their lambs at foot, the lambs sleeping in small dark heaps beside their mothers, the ewes grazing in the last light. 271 lambs had been born by this evening. 256 were alive. The expected losses had been absorbed. The difficult ewes had been helped. The twins had received extra attention. The year's lambing was, in the language Thomas used in his head when he was not writing for the guide, as good as he could have hoped. He did not congratulate himself. Congratulation was not a fell farmer's response to success. What he felt, sitting on the stone in the April evening with Bess at his feet, and the flock below and the valley green around him, was a kind of settled rightness. The work had been done as it needed to be done, and the result was as it needed to be. And the fell had been kind, and the weather had held, and the ewes had done their part, and the lambs had come. The year's central work was complete. He thought about his father, who had sat on this same stone in the Aprils of his tenancy, and his great-uncle Samuel before him, 3 generations, each of them watching the lambs in the April dusk, feeling the same settled rightness. The stone had held them all. The fell had held the stone. Everything was in its proper place. The light went. He stood. He walked down to the farm, Bess at his heel. The lambs quiet in the field. The April evening full of the sounds of a successful lambing settling into the night. The hogs came back from moorland in the 3rd week of April, brought up the valley by Henry Stubbs's son Edward in the traditional drove that the farms of the district had been making since the Stubbs family and the Bragg family had begun their arrangement in 1875. 41 young Herdwicks, 14 months old now, grey-fleeced from their first shearing, arriving at Seathwaite with their winter on the milder lowland behind them and their first summer on the fell ahead of them. Thomas received them at the lower gate. He paid Edward the £18 and 9 shillings that the arrangement required, 9 shillings per hog for the 6 months. Edward was 23 and had been making this drove for 4 years, having succeeded his elder brother in the duty. He was a good driver. The hogs arrived calm, not panicked by the journey, fit for the hill. The hogs would spend the next few weeks in the home field, adjusting to the Seathwaite ground, reorienting to the fell they had not seen since the previous autumn, taking their bearings against the wall lines and the becks, learning or remembering the shape of the land they would be grazing all summer. Then, in mid-May, they would go up to the lower common to begin their real integration into the flock's hef pattern. Thomas watched them in the home field with the particular interest that the returned hogs always produced in him. They were, in their way, the future of the farm, the ewes who would be lambing in 3 years, the mothers of the sheep who would still be here when he was gone, the continuation of the Seathwaite flock into the next tenancy and beyond. He counted them, 41, all present. Edward had brought them home. The hogs would learn the fell as their mothers had learned it, by being taken out onto it in their first summer, grazed in the specific bowl of ground that was Seathwaite's heath, brought back to the inn-by for the night, taken out again the next day, so that by the end of the first summer they knew the heath in the way that Herdwick ewes knew the hef, which was not a matter of intellectual geography, but of bodily orientation, the ground mapped into their own movement patterns, their feet knowing the right paths, their heads lifting at the right moments to recognize the horizon as it should be. This was the work of May. Thomas took the returned hogs up to the lower common on the 10th of May, with Bess beside him, and he spent the day with them. This was not training in the ordinary sense. He did not teach the hogs anything by direct instruction, but was more like walking with them, up the familiar paths, across the bowl, to the edges of the heath boundary, along the boundary with the neighbouring farm's ground back down. The hogs watched him. They watched Bess. They watched the mature ewes who had come up with them and who knew the ground perfectly. They learned by watching. By the 5th day of this, some of the hogs were beginning to graze on their own on the bowl, returning to the body of the flock only at dusk. By the 10th day, all 41 were integrated with the older ewes and had accepted the fell's boundaries without trying to cross them. The heath knowledge, which had taken their mothers a summer to acquire, and which was the breed's most valuable characteristic, was being passed to the next generation, as it had always been passed, by proximity, by repetition, by the quiet instruction of a fell that did not change. Thomas thought, I do not teach them. I walk with them. The fell teaches them. The older ewes teach them. The breed teaches them through whatever mechanism of inheritance the breed possesses. My job is to provide the circumstances in which the teaching can happen. 41 hogs, 41 new members of Seathwaite's Heath. The shearing was done in June, the middle 2 weeks of the month, when the fleeces had reached their full summer weight and the weather had warmed enough that the shorn sheep would not suffer the cold that a late May shearing could produce. Thomas worked with Matthew Tyson from Thorneythwaite, the neighbouring farmer who had been his shearing partner for 19 years, on the principle that the shepherds of the valley helped each other through the shearing weeks in an unwritten arrangement that no one had ever formalized because no one needed to. The shearing technique in Borrowdale was the traditional hand clipping, using long-bladed hand shears that Thomas had inherited from his father and had sharpened himself for 31 years. There were new mechanical clippers being sold at the Eskdale market, which Matthew had mentioned more than once in the spring. But Thomas had never used them and did not intend to. The hand shears worked. They had worked for his father. They would work for him. The pace was steady rather than fast. A good hand shearer could do perhaps 15 ewes in a day. Thomas and Matthew together, with one bringing sheep and the other shearing, could do 30. With the flock of 310 ewes, plus the hogs and the tups, Seathwaite's shearing took 2 weeks of hard work, which they divided. Week 1 at Seathwaite, week 2 at Thorneythwaite. The two farms' shearing combined into one block of consecutive days. By the end of the second week, the fleeces were in the wool store. The newly shorn sheep were back on the fell. Their grey coats now a starker grey, short and even, their bodies visibly lighter. And Thomas's shears were wrapped in their oiled cloth and returned to their hook behind the kitchen door. The fleeces would go to the wool merchant at Keswick in July. The wool would be paid for by weight. The price this year, as last year, would be low. Herdwick wool was coarse and suited only for carpets, and the carpet market was not paying well. But the payment would cover a portion of the farm's costs, and was, like everything else in the year, what it was. At the end of June, Thomas wrote the spring summary in the guide, combining May and June, because the 2 months belonged together in the shepherd's year. The lambing's completion, the hog's integration, the shearing's accomplishment. This was the guide's longest summary of the year, because the spring was the year's central work, and the record of it deserved its fullness. He wrote, Spring, 1884. Lambing April 4th to April 28th. 293 lambs, born to 310 ewes. Good ratio, one of the best in my tenancy. 37 dead, at birth or shortly after. Expected losses. Living lambs at end of April, 256. Will Sowerby from Rostwaite worked the 2 peak weeks, 26 working days from him at a shilling a day, and his keep excellent value for both parties. Moorland hogs returned April 22nd, 41, all well after winter, integrating with the home flock through May. Shearing June 9th to June 22nd, with Matthew Tyson, as in previous years. Fleeces in store, approximately 1,200 pounds weight. Prices will be poor again. Below this, the lambing was the best in 4 years. I cannot credit the Atkinson tup yet. His lambs will not be born until next April. But the existing tups gave good results. Annabel's granddaughter, U94, had twins, both strong. The old line continues, despite last winter's loss. Will Sowerby is developing into a shepherd. If his father at Rostwaite fails to provide for him, he would be good for this farm in the future. I will keep this in mind. He paused. Then he wrote, smaller. The spring has been one of the best I remember. The weather was kind. The ewes did their work. The lambs came well. My health is good. Bess's health is good. What more can a shepherd ask from a spring? July was the month when the flock went to the high fell. The lambs were 8 to 12 weeks old by early July, old enough to travel, old enough to graze alongside their mothers, old enough to begin their own lifelong acquaintance with the heifer that they would occupy for the next 8 or 9 years of their productive lives. Thomas took them up on the first Thursday of July, in the early morning cool, with Bess working the outside of the flock and the lambs staying close to their mothers as the flock moved up the track that had been the track since before anyone had put a name to it. The high fell in July was the Lake District at its most beautiful, the grass long and green on the bowl, the heather beginning to bud for its August flowering, the upper tops clear of cloud more often than not. The whole fell alive with its summer activity. The sheep, the few red grouse, the curlews and the ravens, the flies and midges in their summer profusion, the becks running clear, but not high. Thomas spent longer at the fell in July than he did in any other month, going up at dawn and not returning to the farm until dusk, staying with the flock as they adjusted to the high ground, and the lambs learned to find water and shelter. The lambs had stopped being black. They had lightened, as Herdwick lambs always lightened, to a dark brown, with the white faces and legs that would characterize them for the rest of their lives already showing clearly. In another year, they would be grey-fleeced hogs. In 2 years, grey-fleeced ewes. The progression was as inevitable as the fell itself, and equally visible to the shepherd who knew what he was watching. Thomas sat on the high knowe at noon on the Friday of the first week on the high fell, ate his lunch, bread and cheese and a flask of tea, and watched the flock spread across the bowl. 256 lambs, 310 ewes, 3 tups. The full summer flock of Seathwaite had its maximum size and maximum distribution, occupying the heath that the farm had occupied for centuries. Everything was in its place. Bess was slowing. Thomas had noticed it in the spring, in small signs he had not mentioned to Will Sowerby because he had not wanted to name it before he was certain, but which had accumulated by midsummer into a picture he could no longer avoid. The longer recovery time after a fast run up the fell, the occasional stiffness in the morning, the slight reduction in the sharpness of her attention when the work was less urgent. She was 8. Border collies worked well to 10 or 11 if they were looked after. She had perhaps 2 or 3 more working seasons. He began in July to plan. The farm needed a young dog to train alongside Bess, so that Bess's knowledge could pass to the next dog in the way that Bess's knowledge had passed to her from Meg, the collie who had preceded her and who had died in 1876 after 11 years of work. This had been Thomas's method for 30 years, an old dog training the young one, the knowledge of the work passing from one to the next, the continuity of the partnership preserved across the generations of dogs, just as the Heath knowledge was preserved across the generations of sheep. He spoke to William Fisher at Rostwaite, who bred collies and who had a pup from his best bitch, ready to come at 6 weeks. The pup was a bitch, black and white, good build. Mother was the best working collie in the Upper Valley. Thomas arranged to take her in August, which would give him 3 months of autumn work, with Bess training her before the winter. The pup would be called Floss. She would work alongside Bess through the coming year, learning what Bess knew, taking over the main work gradually, becoming the farm's collie when Bess retired. He wrote in the guide, July 14th, Bess slowing, arranging for a pup from William Fisher's Nell to come in August. We'll name her Floss. Bess and Floss, together through this winter. Continuity. Floss came on the 19th of August, carried from Rostwaite in a basket by William Fisher himself, who brought her at the end of a Sunday afternoon with the deliberate pace of a man delivering something that mattered. She was 8 weeks old, black and white in the classic border collie pattern, with the pale, intelligent eyes that the breed was known for and that Bess had in the fullness of her working maturity. Thomas paid William the £2.10 that they had agreed, which was a fair price for a pup from good working parents, and he carried Floss into the kitchen and set her on the flagstones. Bess was lying by the fire. She stood. She came over to the pup slowly, with the dignified curiosity of an older dog assessing a younger one. Floss, who was 8 weeks old and did not yet know anything about anything, sat down and looked at Bess with the direct attention of a puppy who had decided that this larger dog was important. Bess sniffed. She licked Floss's head once. She returned to the fire. This was the complete introduction. The puppy had been accepted. Thomas did not require more. The working partnership between the old dog and the young one would develop over the coming months in its own time, with Bess's demonstrations of the work and Floss's observation of them and Thomas's occasional corrections. For now, Floss would live in the kitchen and learn the sounds of the farm and the faces of the flock through the wall, and in 3 or 4 weeks, when she had her full coordination and some understanding of basic commands, she would begin to go out on the rounds with Bess, at first only for short distances, gradually for longer ones, eventually for the full working day. He wrote in the guide that evening, August 19th. Floss arrived from Rostwaite, black and white, 8 weeks, good build. Bess approved. Training begins in September. She will be my farm's collie when Bess retires. Continuity is the name of the thing we do. In September, a year now after the story began, Thomas took Floss to the fell for her first lesson. She was 14 weeks old, which was early for real work, but not early for the beginning of the education that would make her a working collie by the following spring. The method he used was the method he had used with every collie he had trained, which was the method William Fisher had used and which Thomas's father had used before him. You took the pup to the sheep, and you watched what she did, and you corrected only the things that were genuinely wrong, and you let the pup's own instinct teach her the rest. Floss did exactly what a well-bred collie pup did on her first introduction to sheep. She stopped. She dropped low. She stared. The ancient predator shape of the collie, rendered useful through centuries of breeding, emerged in her 14-week-old body, as if it had been there all along, which it had been. The eye was the first thing, the fixed, intense gaze that moved sheep without touching them, the inheritance of every collie back to the first ones. Floss had it completely. The sheep moved. Bess watched. She was downwind, 30 yards off, not interfering. Thomas had called her to sit, and she was sitting, though her body was alert with the attention of a working dog, observing what another dog was doing with sheep that were, in some important sense, still hers. Thomas watched Bess watching Floss. He saw Bess's tail twitch when Floss moved a ewe in the wrong direction. He saw Bess's head come up when Floss held her position correctly. Bess was teaching even while sitting, the shape of her attention showing Thomas what the work required, and, in some transferable way, showing Floss too. Floss worked for 10 minutes. Then Thomas called her in and praised her and took her home. 10 minutes was enough for a first lesson. The rest would come. The autumn gather came on the last Saturday of October, as it came every year, with the same shepherds meeting on the same common at first light, and the same flocks coming down from the same heifs to the same in-by fields, the year's cycle completing itself in its exact inherited form. Thomas took Bess and Floss, Bess for the serious work, Floss for the education. He took the guide in his coat pocket. The difference this year was small and enormous. A year had passed since the opening scenes of his record, and the changes that had happened were the changes a shepherd's year could produce. One old ewe gone, 2 new hogs added, a dog aging, and a new dog beginning. A flock that was in its essentials the same flock and in its particulars slightly different. A man who was 1 year older and who found the fell path perhaps a degree steeper than it had been, but still entirely manageable. The gather went as the gather went. The shepherds worked together with the practiced coordination of men who had done this many times together. John Fleming from Herdwick, Richard Atkinson from Stonethwaite, the Braithwaite boys from Thorneythwaite, Tom Morland from the Upper Dale, each taking his accustomed section, each bringing his flock to the sorting ground below the intake wall, each identifying his own sheep by lugmark and smitmark and the dozen small signals of individual recognition that a shepherd developed for his own stock over years of close attention. By noon, the gather was complete. 314 Seathwaite sheep sorted and held, 2 strays identified, a Stonethwaite ewe and a high rig hog, both to be returned at the meet. Thomas wrote the numbers in the guide. He noted, second gather of the record, flock increased by 2 net, all accounted for. The Wasdale meet fell on the first Saturday of November again, as it did every year at the Wasdale Head Inn, with the same shepherds meeting in the same room to return the same kinds of strays and share the same news of the year. Thomas made the journey over Stye Head in mist. The pass was often in mist at this time of year, with the Stonethwaite ewe and the high rig hog and Bess for the walking and Floss for the company and the education. Inside the inn, the shepherds of the Western Valleys had gathered. The Wasdale farmers, the Eskdale men, the Borrowdale contingent to which Thomas belonged, the Ennerdale shepherds who came from farther and arrived later. The room was warm with wet wool and peat smoke. John Fleming from High Rig clapped Thomas on the shoulder and said, "You brought her down. Good." The hog was led out to be collected. The money changed hands for the year's tup hires. The guide pages were consulted for the more difficult strays, the ones whose marks were partial or weathered or otherwise ambiguous. Thomas took the new edition of the Shepherd's Guide when it was handed out. It was the same guide that had been handed out every year since 1817, printed by the same printer, distributed by the association, updated with the marks that had changed since the previous edition. He looked at the Seathwaite entry. It was the same as last year. The mark was the same. The farm was the same. The continuity was the point. He rode home over Styhead in the November dusk. Floss, on her first meet, slept most of the way in the saddlebag. Bess walked alongside, slower than last year, but steady. The three of them, the man, the old dog, the young dog, came down into Borrowdale as the last light left the valley, and Seathwaite Farm came into view below them, and the kitchen window showed a yellow square of lamplight that Thomas had left burning against the dark. He sat in the kitchen on the evening of the 8th of November, which was 3 days after the tups had gone out for the second time in the record, with the guide open on the table before him, and the fire in the range settled for the evening, and Bess in her place by the hearth, and Floss at his feet, chewing on a leather scrap he had given her for the purpose. The flock outside was in its November state, the tups working among the ewes, the rattle marks accumulating on the ewes' fleeces, the lambing year beginning its next iteration. The fell above was in its November quiet, the bracken dying back, the grass giving over to the heather, the stone walls standing in their ancient positions as they had stood for centuries. The valley was preparing for winter. Thomas thought about the year that had passed. He did not do this often, but the guide was in front of him, and the year's notes were visible in his own handwriting, and the completion of a second full cycle. From autumn to autumn, gather to gather, meet to meet, invited the assessment that he would not ordinarily have paused for. 1 year, 312 sheep become 314. Bess aging, Floss beginning. The same fell, the same farm, the same work. He thought, this is what it is. Not a life with large events, but a life with the same events occurring in their right order year after year. The gather and the meet and the tups and the lambing and the shearing and the gather again. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the knowledge accumulating, the knowledge of the flock, the fell, the dog, the weather, the signs, accumulating not because he was trying to accumulate it, but because a man who did this work over decades simply became what the work required. A shepherd of Borrowdale in the year 1884, who knew what the previous shepherds of Borrowdale had known, and who would pass it to the next. He closed the guide. He banked the fire. He went to bed. Thomas spent Christmas alone at Seathwaite, as he had spent most Christmases since his wife Mary's death, which had been in the winter of 1879 and had been the hardest thing the farm had ever given him. His daughter had written from Keswick inviting him for the week. He had written back thanking her and declining, explaining that the winter flock required daily attention and that the journey could not be made and returned in a day. This was the truth. It was also the case that he preferred the quiet Christmas at Seathwaite to the fuller one at Keswick, and that both he and his daughter understood this and accepted it as the current arrangement. He went to the morning service at St. Andrew's in Stonethwaite on Christmas morning, which was a walk of about 2 miles down the dale, and he exchanged the customary greetings with the other farmers of the valley, John Fleming, the Atkinsons, the Morland family, and returned home at noon. He had a piece of mutton for his Christmas dinner, which came from his own flock and which he had hung in the stone larder since the November killing, and he ate it at the kitchen table with Bess and Floss, watching him from their respective positions near the fire. In the afternoon, he walked up the lower fell with both dogs to check on the ewes in the in-by land. It was a clear, cold Christmas afternoon, the fells showing their first proper winter colour, the grey-white of the high tops with the first real snow, the darker grey-brown of the middle fells, the green of the valley below. The ewes were in good condition. He counted them, all present. He went home. He wrote in the guide that evening, Christmas 1883, all ewes accounted for. Flock heavy with lamb. Floss beginning to work. The year continues. He closed the guide. He sat by the fire. He listened to the dogs breathing. He thought about Mary, not at length, but the small clear thought he allowed himself on Christmas evenings, which was simply that she had loved this farm and that he was continuing it on her behalf as well as his own. In January, the flock was fully on the in-by. The high fell had given over to winter in its full form, and even the Herdwicks, who could winter higher than most breeds, had come down to the sheltered ground below the intake wall for the worst of the weather. Thomas fed them every morning, hay from the barn, brought up the track on the sledge he had built 20 years ago for exactly this purpose, the runners worn smooth by 2 decades of January journeys. The January work was quieter than the autumn work, less varied, more a matter of reliable attendance than of complex decision. Feed in the morning, check the walls, break the ice on the water trough, check each ewe for signs of trouble, count, record, go home, do it again tomorrow. The work was what a newspaper writer would have called monotonous, what Thomas would not have called anything. Because he did not describe his work to himself, he simply did it, in the understanding that this was what January shepherding was, and that any attempt to make it something else would be a failure of understanding. Floss was now 5 months old and working reliably for short sessions, an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, with Bess setting the example. She had developed what Thomas considered a promising style, careful, not over-eager, with the eye strong enough to move sheep without pressure, and the patience to wait for the sheep to decide to move rather than forcing them. This was the style Bess had, and which all good Borrowdale collies had, and which was the style that fell sheep required. Anything more aggressive would have driven Herdwicks into stone walls or over edges, and a collie without the patience for fell work was a collie for other work, not this one. He wrote, January 12th, Floss 5 months, working well, style promising. Bess continues to teach. Flock on him by. All well. Lambing 10 weeks away. His daughter Eliza wrote to him at the end of January. Not with any particular news, but with the Sunday afternoon letter that she wrote most weeks. The news of the children and the weather and the household at Keswick. The small details that maintained the connection between the two farms, even when a visit could not be made. Thomas read her letters by the fire on Sunday evenings, over his second cup of tea, with the slow attention of a man who valued his daughter's voice and did not often have it. The letter of the last Sunday in January contained an additional paragraph. Eliza's eldest son, Thomas's grandson, Edward, who was 12, had asked whether he might come to Seathwaite in the spring for a week to help with the lambing. He had been asking this, she wrote, for 2 years, and she had told him he was too young. But he was not too young now. She wanted to know what her father thought. Thomas thought about this for the length of his tea. Edward was a boy he saw twice a year at most, on the occasions when he went to Keswick for the sale, or Eliza brought the children to Seathwaite for a summer visit. He was a quiet boy, according to Eliza, a reader, a noticer, not obviously suited to the farm life that he had, nonetheless asked to come and help with. Thomas wrote back in the evening, in his careful letter-writing hand. He would be glad to have Edward at Seathwaite for the lambing week. The 4th week of April would be the best time. He should bring stout boots and warm clothing, and a willingness to work hard. There would be plenty for him to do. He wrote in the guide after sealing the letter, Edward, coming for lambing. 4th week April, his first time, 12 years old. In February, he began to hear, at the edge of each working day, the signs of what was coming. The ewes were 6 weeks from lambing by the middle of the month, their bodies now clearly heavy with the lambs, their movements slower, their grazing more deliberate. The older ewes, the ones who had lambed for 4 or 5 seasons, walked with the confident ease of animals who knew what their bodies were doing. The younger ewes, in their second season, were less settled, shifting their weight more, looking for sheltered ground. He listened to the flock differently in February. The summer shepherding was a matter of watching. The high fell, the scattered flock, the distant grey shapes against the bracken. The winter shepherding was a matter of presence. The in-by field, the hay distribution, the daily count. February was a matter of listening, walking among the ewes and hearing the small changes in the sounds of the flock that indicated the approach of lambing, the way certain ewes were quieter than they had been, the way others were more restless. On the 18th of February, at the afternoon check, he noticed that the oldest ewe, number 41 in his personal numbering, an 8-year-old who had lambed 7 times previously, had separated herself from the main flock and was standing at the far corner of the in-by, under the rowan that grew from the wall. This was not yet labour. It was 6 weeks too early for that. But it was the older ew's instinct for the quiet corner beginning to operate, her body telling her where she would want to be when the time came. He noted the corner. He would remember it in April. He wrote, February 18th, Old ewe, 41, choosing her corner. Rowan in lower in-by. We'll check her there, come lambing. Lambing began on the 6th of April, 2 days later than the previous year, within the range of normal variation, the result of the tubs having gone out a day earlier by the lunar calendar that Thomas did not keep, but that the sheep observed without being aware of it. The first lamb was born to ewe number 53, a 4-year-old with good mothering form, at 4 in the morning of the 6th. Thomas was at the inn-by at 4:30, having heard the quality of change in the flock's sounds from his kitchen window, where he slept lightly during lambing, and woke to the small signals in the distant murmur of the sheep. The lamb was on its feet already when he arrived, nuzzling at the ewe for colostrum. Black-fleeced as all Herdwick lambs were black-fleeced, its small body showing the distinctive Herdwick proportions in miniature. The ewe was attentive. The lamb would do. The rhythm of the second lambing was not the same as the first lambing, no two lambings ever being the same, because no two sets of weather and flock condition and individual ewe behavior were ever the same. But the underlying structure was identical. The days of many lambs and the days of few, the easy births and the difficult ones, the ewes that managed by themselves and the ewes that required intervention, the lambs that thrived and the lambs that did not. Thomas moved through the lambing with the same methodical attention he had brought to the previous year, but with Floss now also helping. Small tasks, appropriate to her 9 months of age, the kind of work a young dog could do without the experience the difficult tasks required. By the 15th of April, which was the midpoint of the lambing period, he had 84 lambs on the ground and 21 ewes still to lamb. The mortality was low. 3 stillborn, 1 ewe lost to a difficult delivery despite his intervention, which was the ordinary statistical background of a lambing of this size. He wrote the numbers in the guide. He continued the work. Edward arrived on the 22nd of April, having travelled from Keswick by the morning coach as far as Rostwaite, and then walked the remaining 3 miles up the dale to Seathwaite, a journey he had made with his mother several times as a younger boy, and could now make alone, he had insisted, and which he had managed without incident, arriving at the farm at 11 in the morning, with his pack on his back and the quiet attentiveness that Thomas remembered from his previous visits, slightly more assertive now that he was 12. Will Sowerby, the boy from Rostwaite, who had helped with the lambing's main weeks, had gone home 3 days before. The peak was past, and the boy was needed back at his own family's farm. Edward's visit would overlap with the lambing's tail end, which was quieter work, better for a boy learning. Thomas took him through the routine of the farm, the kitchen, the dresser with the guide, the dogs, the fold yard, the in-by field with its lambing ewes. Edward watched and listened with the focused attention of a boy who was trying to learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. He was not afraid of the sheep, a good sign, Thomas noted. Many 12-year-olds were intimidated by mature ewes, and he listened to the dogs' names and their respective roles without having to be told twice. "Can I help?" Edward said. "You already are. Watch today. Tomorrow I'll give you work." Edward watched all that afternoon. He sat on the wall near the lambing field with Floss, who, being young, had more tolerance for a boy's company than Bess did at her age, and observed. Thomas went about the lambing work and did not perform for his grandson. The work was what it was. The boy could see it at its own speed. By evening, Edward had seen 3 lambs born, had helped Thomas carry a ewes afterbirth to the compost heap and had not asked a single unnecessary question. Thomas wrote that evening in the guide, April the 22nd. Edward arrived. Good sense. Watches. We'll give him work tomorrow. The week of Edward's visit was, Thomas understood by the second day, not only a lambing week, but a week of teaching. The boy wanted to know how the work was done, and being a practical boy rather than a talkative one, he wanted to know by doing it. Thomas gave him tasks at a pace Edward could manage, feeding the orphan lamb that had been rejected by its mother, carrying water to the trough, carrying the peat for the kitchen fire, helping to move an exhausted ewe into shelter, filling the hay racks. On the fourth day, Thomas took Edward to the fell. Not far, only to the first wall, because the main flock was still in the inn by, and the fell was quiet, and showed him the lug marks on the Herdwick ewe they took with them, explaining the system. Left ear, right ear, the notches that said Seathwaite, the variations that said the other farms. He showed Edward the guide in his coat pocket. He let Edward hold it and turn the pages. Every farm, Edward said. Every farm, hundreds of marks, goes back to 1817. Edward read the entries with the absorbed attention of a boy who liked written things and had found one he had not known existed. So if you find a sheep you don't know, you look up the mark and you know whose it is, and you bring her home to him. That's why they don't get lost. That's why they don't get lost. Edward looked at the page for another long moment. Then he said, I could learn this. Yes, Thomas said, you could. Edward left on the morning of the 29th of April. His pack heavier with the farm honey and wool samples Thomas had given him to take to his mother, and with something less tangible but more important, a week's exposure to a kind of life he had only read about, and which he now knew in his body as well as his mind. He had helped with the lambing of 11 ewes. He had fed orphan lambs. He had read the guide from first page to last. He had walked the fell path to the first wall 3 times. He had learned the names of 8 of the Seathwaite ewes. At the farm gate, before they began the walk down to Rostwaite, where the coach would collect him, Edward stopped and looked back at the farmhouse and the fold yard and the in-by field with the ewes and the new lambs. Next year, he said. Thomas said, every year, if you want to. I want to. Then every year. They walked down to Rostwaite in silence. That was the comfortable silence between 2 quiet people who had decided something together and did not need further conversation to confirm it. Thomas saw Edward onto the coach. He walked back up the dale to Seathwaite. The farm was as he had left it. The lambing continued. The guide was on the dresser. He wrote in the guide that evening, April 29th. Edward returned to Keswick. Will come for lambing every year. The farm has a boy now. Shearing came in early July, as it came every year, with the same shearers arriving at the same time, and the same neighbours helping, and the same system of folds and sorting and clipping and wool collection that had been the shearing system in this valley for longer than any living person could remember. Thomas had written in the guide after the first year's shearing. He wrote more briefly after the second year's shearing, because the second year required less explanation than the first. The wool was heavier this year than last. The Herdwick fleeces a good grey, the hollow fibres dense and weather-resistant, the clip producing a better weight per animal than the previous year. Thomas attributed this to the mild winter and the good spring grass. Conditions the sheep had enjoyed showed in the fleece. He also noted, without comment, that Floss had worked the shearing flock for the first time and had performed with competence beyond her year. After the shearing, the ewes returned to the high fell for the summer, as they did every year. The hefted flock resuming its ancient pattern, each ewe returning to her own heath, each hog learning from its mother where it belonged. Thomas watched them go up the path from the fold yard on the 3rd of July. They went without hesitation. They knew where they were going. He wrote, July 3rd, flock to fell, 314 ewes, 89 lambs. The hefting holds. The knowledge passes as it should. Bess watched them go. Floss worked them. The year continues. Bess declined gradually through the summer. Thomas did not describe her decline to himself as a decline. That was too definite a word for the daily small changes that added up to something the body knew. He noted that she slept more, that she stayed closer to the house when Thomas went to the fell, letting Floss do the distant work, that she drank more water on warm days, that her gait, though still competent, had a slight unevenness that had not been there last summer. She was, he calculated, 8.5 years old. For a working collie, this was the beginning of old age, the years when the body started to suggest that the work which had been easy was becoming less easy. Her mother had lived to 14, working to 12. Bess might do the same, but the signs had begun, and Thomas respected the signs. The partnership adjusted without ceremony. Floss, now 11 months old and working reliably, took over the long distances, the gathering on the upper fell, the runs after stray sheep that the older Bess no longer attempted. Bess worked the close quarters, the fold yard sorting, the in-by field management, the daily counts where her steady eye and long experience were still the best tool for the job. It was a functional division that Thomas had not planned, but that had developed on its own, each dog doing what she could still do well, and the farm benefiting from both. He wrote in August, Bess slowing, Floss taking the fell. Between them, the work continues. Good dogs both, the farm lucky. He sat on the large flat stone at the top of the first wall, the same glacial erratic where he had sat a year ago in the opening pages of this record, on the evening of the 24th of August, in the summer twilight of the Lake District, with the flock on the fell above him and Bess at his feet and Floss at a small distance, chasing something imaginary in the bracken. A year had passed since the first of these pauses. The fell was the same. The flock was in its essentials the same. The dogs were different, the old one older, the young one now young no longer. He himself was a year older, with the small accommodations that age had begun to require from his body, and that he accepted the way he accepted the weather, as conditions of the work rather than as reasons to change the work. The valley below was in its August evening quiet. The whitewashed farmhouses, Seathwaite, the farm at the foot of the track, Stonethwaite farther down, Rostwaite in the distance, showed their evening lights one by one as the light went out of the sky and the coal smoke rose straight in the still air from each kitchen chimney. The beck ran silver between the alders, louder in the evening quiet than it had been all day. The fell darkened behind him against a sky that held the last gold of the summer day. He thought about Edward. He thought about the guide, which was on the dresser at home, open to the August pages. He thought about the next year's lambing, which would come, as next year's lambing always came, in April. He thought about Bess's slowing and Floss's learning and the inevitable small changes that would accumulate in the years to come. And he thought about all of this without alarm, because none of it was alarming. It was all part of the same continuity, the same fell, the same flock, the same ancient arrangement of shepherd and dog and sheep and stone wall that the valley had maintained for 1,000 years and would maintain after him. The last light left the valley. The stars began to appear above Scafell. He stood. He whistled to the dogs. They came. The three of them walked home through the August dust to the farm, with its kitchen window already lit, and the guide on the dresser, waiting for the evening's entry. The autumn gather was called for the last Saturday of September, the same date as the previous year, because the date was the date the district had agreed on, and the date did not change from year to year except in cases of extreme weather. Thomas prepared as he had prepared the previous year, the coat, the crook, the guide in the pocket. Bess ready though slower. Floss eager and full of her first adult working year. Edward was with them. He had come up from Keswick for the weekend, having asked permission from his school, and received it on the grounds of learning the farm that his family was connected to. He was 12 years and 4 months old. He carried his own crook now, a smaller one that Thomas had made for him in August from an ash branch from the hedge. They went up the fell at first light. The gather began. The valley's shepherds arrived one by one at their accustomed positions. The dogs worked. Edward worked beside Thomas, doing what he could do and watching what he could not yet do. Floss worked the upper fell with the energy of a young dog in her prime. Bess worked the sorting at the foot, where her experienced eye made her the best dog for the detailed work. By noon, the gather was complete. 317 Seathwaite sheep sorted and accounted for. 3 strays identified for return. The year's new hogs were identified and marked and entered in the guide. Edward took the pencil from Thomas and wrote one of the entries in his own careful 12-year-old handwriting at Thomas's invitation. The entry was the first piece of the guide in a 3rd generation's hand. Thomas closed the guide at the end of the day. 2 years of entries. The first year in his hand, the second year in his hand, and now the first entry in Edward's hand beneath them. The continuity passed. He wrote the final entry of the second year's record on the evening of the last Saturday of October, which was the day of the second gather of the record, and the end of the annual cycle he had been keeping in the guide. He wrote at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and both dogs asleep in their places, and the fell outside dark and silent under the autumn sky. He wrote, Autumn 1884. Gather complete. Flock 317. 3 strays for return at Wasdale meet. Edward present at gather. First proper work will come every year. Floss working the fell. Bess working close. The year completes as it began, differently. Next year's tubs go out November 5th. He paused. Then he wrote, in a slightly smaller and more careful hand, The shepherd's guide of Seathwaite has been kept on this dresser since my father. It will be kept here after me. Edward has been shown it. He understands what it is. When the time comes, it will pass to him or to the tenant who follows me. The sheep will stay with the farm, as they have always stayed with the farm. And the guide will stay with the farm, and the fell will stay with the farm, because the fell stays with itself, and we only walk on it for a time. This is what the arrangement is. It has held for 1,000 years. It will hold. He closed the guide. He placed it on the dresser in its position between the ledger and the almanac, where it had been since before he was born, and where it would remain after he was gone. He banked the fire. He called the dogs. He went to bed. The fell above Seathwaite was dark. The flock was on its hoof. The stone walls stood in their ancient positions. The valley held the darkness, and the stars held the sky. And in the farmhouse, a man slept beside his 2 dogs, while the sheep kept the knowledge they had always kept, the knowledge of where they belonged, passed from mother to daughter in an unbroken line that went back 1,000 years and would go forward so long as there were shepherds who knew how to listen to what the sheep already knew, and who could be patient enough to learn it again each season, and who would teach it in turn to the boys who came to the farm in April, willing to watch and to wait and to understand what the fell was telling them. This was the arrangement. It had held. It would hold.